land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So our topic for today is race and critical race theory. So in today's lecture, we're going to cover the topic of race, and specifically what we're going to explore is the proposition that although race is not a biological or genetic reality or category, it is a legal, political, economic, and social reality. So scholars of race, theorists of race, generally argue that race is a modern idea. And that does not mean that in earlier periods there were no physical differences among human beings. Differences in skin color most likely evolved between 10 and 20,000 years ago. It also doesn't mean that human beings did not behave in insular and exclusionary ways toward others they considered outsiders. Human history is full of evidence that human beings have long lived in communities and that they distinguished between insiders and outsiders, between community members and non-members. Nor does it mean that human beings didn't treat members of outgroups differently than they treat their own people. People have been excluding, enslaving, and going to war against outsiders for millennia. So what is modern about race is the use of race as a tool for social categorization and the construction of hierarchies based on physical characteristics and differences that have been commonly understood as biologically rooted, immutable, and linked to continental populations like Africans, Europeans, Asians, and so forth. So this modern conception of race dates to the 1600s, starting in the pre-colonial period of so-called discovery and intercontinental trade. So as European explorers and adventurers and traders and colonizers came into contact with people on other continents, they started to note their differences. So as Europeans came into contact with Africans and Indians, people in the Americas, and so on, the relevant distinction that they made was religious. So the distinction that they noted was that the others, the people from other continents, were heathen. They were not Christian. And the difference was between Christians and non-Christians, and also between the civilized and the uncivilized. So initially, the relevant markers of racial distinction were Christianity and civilization, rather than skin color and facial features. So this is a painting, for example, which is titled First Encounters, Native Americans and Christians. Okay, so the reason that I'm showing you this painting is not only because it's about the encounter between so-called Europeans and so-called Native Americans or indigenous, what we would now call indigenous people, but also that it's titled Native Americans and Christians. What was relevant about the Europeans was that they were Christian. And it was this travel under the mantle of discovery and trade and resource extraction that introduced two ideas about race that would go on to become very important components of modern theories of race. The first was, as I mentioned before, that race was connected to continents. There were Europeans, who were the people from places like Britain and France and Portugal and Spain, who traveled to other continents. And then there were the people that they found on those other continents, the Africans, the Asians, the indigenous Americans, and so forth. So they categorized populations of other continents as races, and that's how it is that we think of races as connected to regions of the world. Second, they established the notion of hierarchy. And the hierarchy, as I've said, was initially rooted in differences of religion and civilization. And that would end up being at the core of modern conceptions of race, is this idea of hierarchy. Europeans are Christian and civilized, and therefore superior to Africans, Native Americans, and so on. And it is in fact this hierarchy that's embedded in a distinction marked by Christianity and civilization that justified the slave trade. So it was precisely the fact that people from other continents were not human because they were not Christian and therefore not in possession of souls. That is what justified buying and selling people as slaves. So race works as, if we ask what work race is doing, the answer in a certain period was race is doing the work of justifying the slave trade. Now, just as a caveat, this is not to say that slavery didn't exist before, but it was generally justified. Slavery had generally been justified as a result of war and conquest. So this is the beginning of slavery that was justified by racial differences. In fact, there's a famous Spaniard named Bartolomé de las Casas, Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish clergyman who traveled to the Americas in the 1500s. And he's well known because he was one of the early voices of opposition to this conception of race. So Las Casas believed that indigenous people in the Americas were human and therefore deserved equal treatment. So he argued that enslavement and subjugation were unjust because indigenous people were not inferior barbarians or animals, but rather rational beings who could be converted to Christianity. And that's one of the important differences between early modern conceptions of race and later conceptions of race, is this possibility of conversion. The idea that if the difference between Europeans and the rest of the world is if the composition of race is Christianity and civilization, then races are not biologically distinct and they're not permanent. People from other continents, people of different races can be civilized and they can be converted. They can become European. So initially, race was not considered permanent. It was a condition, essentially, that could be overcome. And so what I'm outlining here is the evolution of the concept of race. And one of the reasons that Bartolomé de las Casas is important is that he was responsible for some changes to Spanish laws in the Americas, but even more importantly, he was influential in generating a debate about the ethics of slavery and the humanity of non-Europeans. So in different periods, you have different people arguing about what race is, what is the substance of race, and what kinds of laws and policies. It can justify what kind of behavior, and ethical behavior in particular, it can justify. And so that's how you get the evolution of the idea of race. So those debates like this eventually changed ideas and common conceptions of what race was and what types of social and political institutions it would warrant or justify. So subsequent theories of racial difference would go beyond Christianity and civilization to make the case that people of other races were human, but they were childlike. So this was relevant in the context of arguments about citizenship and colonial government and the franchise, who is allowed to vote and who was not. So democracies do not allow children to vote. All democratic forms of government limit the franchise, limit the vote to adults. And so the argument that people of other races are childlike stood as a justification for disqualifying them from citizenship, disqualifying them from voting, and excluding them from national identity. At the same time, the designation of people who are racially distinct as childlike also underpins arguments in favor of colonialism, so against self-government. So the argument here is that colonialism is justified. We have democracy at home, we have self-government at home, and colonialism is justified for people of different races because they are not capable of self-rule. The so-called natives, the natives of Africa, of India, of North America, are not ready to govern themselves because they are functionally equivalent to children. So now the debate is between those who believe that they are, that so-called others, people, members of other races, are permanently children, or whether they can be, as is the case with civilization, educated to become European, essentially to become European or to become white, to become adults. And that would mean that they would be capable of self-government. So some people argued that with proper tutelage, education, etc., people who are colonized would be able eventually to govern themselves in the future, and other people argued that the childlike qualities of colonial subjects were permanently and biologically ingrained. So before we move on to biological and genetic conceptions of race that would become hegemonic in the second half of the 18th century, I want to pause to point out the ways in which these different evolving ideas about race serve political purposes and operations of power. In other words, our ideas about race fit nicely into governance projects and socioeconomic projects that we're engaged in the world, right? Race justifies slavery, race justifies colonialism, but in each case, it's a different conception of race that does the justificatory work. The kernel of race changes, like what race is, what it means, what it hinges on, and how it draws boundaries. All of those things shift, and they shift as they're used, as race is used to explain and justify and sustain different operations of power that subjugate, that exclude, enslave, extract, and even kill. So this is what it means to say that race is a legal, political, economic, and social reality. Race is a concept that's invented and deployed for the purpose of forging and then sustaining a certain set of legal, political, economic, and social relationships and boundaries. Race has not been a static concept. It's not a concept that has remained the same over time. So the markers and the meanings and the boundaries of race have shifted over time and across space. So in different parts of the world, race means different things to different people. It gets deployed differently in support of different socioeconomic relations. It bolsters different operations of power, and that's why race is not the same everywhere. So one of the things that I'm doing in today's lecture is showing you how race has changed over time and how different definitions of race serve different purposes. So we're going to move now from early modern understandings of race to the conceptions of race that became dominant in the late 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. Some of you may be familiar with the field of eugenics. Eugenics is also a sort of a slippery concept. It meant many things, many theories and goals were subsumed under the category of eugenics. But in general, eugenicists had three goals. The whole point of eugenics was to study and to establish the scientific existence of racial difference. The second point or objective of eugenics was to prove the proposition that race was correlated with hierarchical differences. So some races were superior. So not only were there races, but some races were superior and some were inferior. And the third objective of eugenics was to improve the human race by breeding out inferior races in favor of superior races. And I'm putting superior and inferior in quotation marks. This is the project of eugenics, is this idea that there's a hierarchy of race and that the objective of eugenics is to reduce the number of inferior populations in favor of breeding more members of the superior populations. So from the scientific perspective, what eugenicists were trying to do was to get a handle on what the different races were, what the physical, intellectual, and emotional characteristics of races were, in order to make the study of race scientific. So they hope to get to a point, for example, where you could tell a person's race just from measuring their skull or measuring the length of a person's femur. In fact, eugenicists spent a great deal of time measuring human body parts. They measured the size of people's skulls and the prominence of their foreheads, the slant of their nose, the size of their lips. And the goal was to construct typologies so that human beings could be classified in terms of distinct biological races. And in the early 20th century, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, which was essentially the height of the eugenics movement, sometimes in connection with world fairs, it was very popular to have human zoos. Human beings were brought from exotic and distant places like Africa or the Amazon, North America, Asia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and they were made to live for months in recreations of their natural dwellings. So recreations of their villages back home on full view of thousands of visitors. So people would come to see how they lived in their natural habitat, which had been also brought with them. So the idea here, the idea of these human zoos, was to educate Europeans about particular racial categories and features. So the people who were brought in and made to be on show in these human zoos were brought as specimens of particular racial categories or features or classifications of humans in the world. So these human zoos were meant to offer evidence of racial difference and of racial superiority and inferiority. A very famous instance of this is, of which you may have already heard of, was when Sarah Baartman, who was a Khoisan slave from the Eastern Cape of South Africa, was brought to England in, well, this is earlier, right, than I'm talking about. So Sarah Baartman, also called Sarki Baartman, was brought to England in 1810. She was exhibited around Britain before crowds of people. And she was posed nude for so-called scientific paintings. So her body was used as a specimen of a particular racial category. And then she was sold to someone in France and also exhibited there before she died in 1815 at the age of 26, possibly of smallpox. And then, after she died, her skeleton, along with preserved parts of her body, were exhibited at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris until 1974. And then in 2002, her remains were finally returned to South Africa and buried near the place she was born. One related and brief article that I asked you to read for today is about a collection of human skulls at a museum at University of Pennsylvania. So these skulls were collected by a well-known eugenicist named Samuel Morton, who was doing research that was meant to prove Black inferiority using the skulls of Black people. And then these skulls ended up at UPenn in their museum. Up until 2020, some of these skulls were on display in a glass case in a classroom. And in 2021, Penn started to consider how to return the skulls to their communities. So 19 of the skulls were buried in a Philadelphia cemetery in 2024, but Penn still is holding on to the rest of them, mainly it seems because they don't know who to repatriate them to. So this is just an example of the work that eugenicists were doing and the way that work still exists in the world today, and is still controversial. The work is not controversial. The work has been completely disparaged, but the objects, the skulls that were at the sort of at the center of eugenics, so-called scientific exploration, are still around in our world today. So eugenics was particularly powerful and influential in Britain and in the US. In Britain, because it legitimated British rule over colonial subjects who were not white, and in the United States because it legitimated first slavery and then racial subjugation. So the eugenics movement starts around the middle of the 1800s, and it was most powerful in the early 1900s, and then mostly fell into disfavor after World War II. So besides being powerful and popular in the United States and Britain, as well as in Canada, there was a strong eugenics movement, especially in southern Ontario. Eugenics was also especially powerful and sort of hegemonic as an ideology in Germany. So you may already be thinking ahead of me that eugenics had its high point during World War II in the genocidal policies of Hitler and of Nazi Germany. So Hitler and his government, of course, believed firmly in eugenics. The Hitler government classified Germans and some other Northern Europeans as Aryans, and they deployed scientific racism to justify the exclusion and eventually the extermination of Jews and Roma and others who were considered racially and genetically inferior. And it was, in fact, because of the Holocaust that the ideology of eugenics was eventually abandoned. So not only did Nazi Germany murder 6 million Jews, along with other categories of people it deemed inferior, but it also performed experiments on human subjects, experiments that were meant in part to establish both racial difference and racial hierarchy. So eugenics was a big part of the scientific project of Nazi Germany. And the Holocaust essentially revealed the logical endpoint of eugenics. If you believe in racial difference, and if you believe that some categories of people are superior to others, and you also believe that the world should be improved by eliminating the inferior categories of people, then it becomes clear that the logical endpoint of a belief in eugenics is genocide. It's the extermination of populations who were considered racially inferior. So this is the process through which the project and the normative assumptions and implications of eugenics lost favor. Eugenics came to be understood as morally repugnant, as a morally unacceptable idea. But there is also a parallel story about how eugenics crumbles as science, about how the whole theory of races and racial difference that's at the root of eugenics crumbles as science because it gets revealed as unscientific with the rise and advance of the field of genetics. So there are two things that happen roughly at the same time. So eugenics, which is the belief essentially in racial difference and racial hierarchy, eugenics gets discredited as an ideology and disproven as science. So we know why it gets discredited as ideology. That happens essentially because eugenics, the idea of eugenics, is connected to the idea of the Holocaust or to the fact of the Holocaust. The idea of eugenics is connected to the fact of the Holocaust, and in the post-World War II area, therefore eugenics becomes very, very unpopular ideologically. But it also gets disproven as science. And what happens here is that as the study of genetics and genetic variation progressed, scientists found that there is only 0.1% genetic variation among human beings. So 99.9% of human genes are the same. Of the 0.1% that are different, 85% of that difference is found within any given population. So by population, I mean race. So 85% of the difference is among people that are ostensibly of the same racial category, and 7% is found between populations within a continent, and only 8% is found on average between the races, between the categories we call races. So what geneticists have found is that there is more genetic diversity within a continental population, within a so-called race, than between these populations. So what you have here on this slide of Africa is basically, it's an image of genetic variation in Africa. So what this shows is that populations that evolve in isolation from one another may display genetic variation. So that's why you see this pattern here with blobs of different genetic profiles instead of just a blur of pixelated dots representing randomly varying individual human beings. But these genetic variations do not map onto racial categories as we understand them. So there's all of this. What you can see here on this map is how much genetic variation there is among people from Africa, even among people from sub-Saharan Africa, who we think of as being all members of a single race. And apparently, there is more genetic diversity among people from Africa than there is between people from Africa and people from Norway. So the simple sentence that explains why race is not a scientific category rooted in genetic variation or biological difference is essentially that 99%, that there's no genetic marker for race, right? And equally important, possibly even more important, whatever genetic variation does exist does not correlate with any marker of inferiority or superiority, such as intelligence or cognitive capacity. So our folkloric way of dividing up the world racially into white, black, Asian, and so forth, that has no basis in genetics. In fact, genetics has fully deconstructed the idea of race. And what that means is that race does not exist as a biological and genetic set of categories or way of organizing the populations of the world. Race does not exist. And yet, of course, we also know that race does exist as part of the lived experience and reality of most people alive in the world today. So we have what is, from the perspective of social science, a very interesting phenomenon. which is that the substantive biological and genetic essence of race disappears, but the lived experience of race persists. And so, as social scientists, this leads us to ask the following question. If race doesn't exist, if it doesn't spring from biological essence, if it doesn't have its origin in genetic variations that can be used to neatly classify and organize human beings into different racial categories, if race doesn't exist, then why is race such a powerful framework of lived experience? And one way of thinking about critical race theory is that it is an attempt to answer this question. So, one of the things that Kimberly Crenshaw says in the article we read for this week is that laws and customs create races out of a broad range of human traits. Laws and customs create races out of a broad range of human traits. So critical race theory grew out of a movement called critical legal studies that started in the 1970s. So most lawyers and legal scholars simply take the law and they apply it. They start with the law as it is and they ask, how does it fit this case? Critical legal scholars, on the other hand, asked, why is the law as it is? What work is this law doing? How is it impacting some people and not others, and so on and so forth? So CLS scholars, critical legal scholars, were arguing that the law is not neutral, that the law is actively used to uphold existing social hierarchies. So let me give you some examples. We have a conventional legal distinction between public and private spheres. Critical legal scholars argued that that distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere does the work of hiding or rendering invisible crimes like domestic abuse. The criminal justice system disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. Rape laws are structured in such a way that they favor male defendants. These are the kinds of insights that critical legal scholars were developing about the ways in which law was not neutral. So in the 1980s, critical race theorists came along and they said, this is a really good framework for understanding how the legal system, but also the political system and the criminal justice system and so on, how all of these systems create and sustain race. So not only create and sustain existing social hierarchies, but also create and sustain race. So it's important that you understand what I mean by create and sustain race. When social theorists say that race is constructed, what they mean is that the meaning that race is imbued with, the meaning that race carries, is constructed, and that the boundaries of race are also constructed. And the meaning and boundaries of race are partly constructed by government policies and laws. So nobody means that skin color and facial features are constructed. What they mean is that the fact that those things have meaning, that they affect our perception of who people are and where they belong and what rights they have, these are the things that are socially constructed. The meaning of this concept is the thing that's constructed. So let me offer an example. Let's take two customs let's take two countries with large white and black populations. South Africa and the United States. Over the course of 400 years, in each country, you end up with a large population that is mixed race. In South Africa, people who are mixed race are categorized as colored, and they had, under apartheid, more rights, more funding, better housing, and so forth than people who were classified as African or black. So colored was a legal, social, and political category that was specifically created by the South African government, a separate racial category that didn't exist, does not exist in the United States, or for that matter in Canada. A category of human being, a racial category that only exists in South Africa because it served a purpose in the context of apartheid South Africa. So in the United States, you also have a lot of people who are mixed race. Most African Americans are, in fact, mixed race. But in the US, we have a different rule, which is the so-called one-drop rule. So anyone who has any black ancestry, well, officially anyone with 1/16 black ancestry, is classified as black. So whereas in South Africa, everyone understands and sees a distinction between colored and black people, in the United States, that boundary doesn't exist. And it's not just a semantic issue. Racial classification had a real impact on people's lives and life chances. So that's a very obvious example of the ways in which governments create race. They create categories that we wouldn't understand otherwise as being, or that they create categories that are not natural. They take people who are of mixed race, and that is something natural, right? People are born and they have a parent who's white and a parent who's black. That is a potentially natural thing. But the fact that they then get put into a particular category and that category has meaning, that's what we mean by the idea that race is constructed. And the idea here, coloreds are just an example that is clear because that racial category is distinctive to South Africa. But critical race theorists and all social theorists would argue that all of race is constructed in that way. So critical race theory is the study of the way that law, but also other systems and institutions, reflect and produce racial power. And by racial power, I mean two things. I mean white power and racial oppression on the one hand, but also the power of race to determine life outcomes. So this lecture is about the evolution of different conceptions of race within the period of modernity. It's about how the content and meaning of race have evolved over time in support of different configurations of power, different political projects. So it was a particular understanding of race that justified slavery, and another definition or understanding of race that legitimated colonialism. So one of the arguments made by critical race theorists is about the particular operation of racial power that is supported by liberal conceptions of race. In other words, if I say to you that in the 1600s there was a particular conception of race that sustained a certain set of power relations, including slavery, and in the 1800s and 1900s, a eugenicist conception of race as biologically determined hierarchy justified and legitimated the Holocaust, among many other racialized systems of oppression and atrocity, that I would expect someone to ask, what are our contemporary views of race and how are they sustaining racialized systems of power? And so that's what we're turning to now. That's where critical race theory comes in. So liberalism's approach to race is to maintain a formal stance of colorblindness. The law treats everyone as equal and does not discriminate with regard to race. So critical race theorists see liberalism's colorblindness as a tool that maintains white advantage and upholds the status quo, the racial status quo. So what color blindness does, blindness to color does, is it allows those in power to avoid confronting or addressing racial disparities. If the law treats everyone equally, then actual existing inequalities must be the result of individual or cultural shortcomings rather than systemic discrimination. So, by refusing to acknowledge race, color blindness obscures the ways in which laws and policies and practices continue to disadvantage people of color, people who are racialized. So, again, liberalism's formal stance of equality, everybody is equal under the law, makes it seem as if the system is fair. Everyone is equal under the law. And therefore, any racism that exists is an individual aberration from the system. So liberalism's approach to race is basically to say there may be a few individual racists, but the system itself is neutral and colorblind. It's blind to differences of race. And what critical race theorists would argue is that ostensible neutrality of the law sustains the inequalities that already exist. In other words, liberal colorblindness is superimposed on a playing field that does not start out as equal. So even places like Canada, that has only a very limited experience or history of slavery as compared to the United States, for example. Even Canada has a very long history of racial inequality, of sunset towns where Black people were allowed to work during the day but had to leave before sundown, of housing and employment discrimination, of loan and banking discrimination, racial disparities of incarceration, life expectancy, and so on. So a history of creating, because of specific policies, not by chance, but a history of creating a very unlevel playing field. And then it's against this backdrop that the work that colorblindness is doing is to erase that history, to wipe clean the slate, so to speak. So in a context of significant inequality, equality under the law, formal equality, sustains the status quo. So let's take a clear example, such as when universities use a colorblind formula to admit student applicants. In a society where we know that racialized kids tend to go to worse schools, they have fewer academic opportunities, they have parents who had fewer academic and educational opportunities, and so on, colorblind admissions is going to ensure that most people who get into a university are the children of people who have been historically advantaged. That policy, that colorblind policy, is going to sustain the status quo, and the status quo is an unequal playing field. And so critical race theorists argue that logic about admissions, which is clear when it comes to admissions, to looking at how people get into a university or a private school or any other thing that people want to get into, extends beyond that logic that we're familiar with when it comes to admissions. That logic extends beyond admissions to sustain a racial hierarchy of white power more generally. So let me offer another example from our reading for this week. So Kim Crenshaw argues that the American legal system requires that a finding of discrimination can only be made with proof of intent. While discriminatory intent need not be the only motive, a violation occurs when the evidence shows that the entity adopted a policy at issue because of, not merely in spite of, its adverse effects upon an identifiable group. So intent is, you can only find evidence of a violation when you also find that somebody actually adopted a policy because of its adverse effects upon a group of people. They adopted it for the purpose of having that adverse effect. They didn't adopt it in spite of, so even knowing that it would have an adverse effect. So let me offer you an example of what Crenshaw means here. Let's say a company hires 100 people, and not a single one of the people it hires is a member of a racialized group. The company has 100 positions to fill, and every single position goes to a white man. The only way to prove that racism is at play in this case is to find, or that discrimination is at play in this case, is to find an actual human being who will admit that he used race as a criterion of selection. There has to be what the courts call intent. So that's an identifiable act of prejudice that was meant to produce a particular outcome. And so we have to be able to trace selection back to an identifiable act of prejudice. Otherwise, the fact that the outcome, the fact that the result appears to be discriminatory, the fact that not a single black person was hired appears to be discriminatory, is not in itself evidence of racism. So in actual fact, there is actually some nuance here. When it comes to employment practices, the court accepts a disparate impact theory. So the theory holds that an employment practice could be found discriminatory if it had disproportionately adverse effects on members of a protected class, even if there was no intent to discriminate. So when it comes to cases of employment, you can have a disparate impact. You can look at disparate impact without having to prove intent. But the court also proved held in 1976 that proof of discriminatory intent is required for claims of constitutional violations under the Equal Protection Clause. So it's not required in employment cases, but it is required in constitutional cases. And the liberal position, Crenshaw argues, that the liberal position is the one that operates at the level of constitutional claims. And the statutory discrimination claims, in which the requirement for intent was relaxed, is generally understood or interpreted as a deviation from liberal principle, and also a problematic deviation from liberal principle. So a liberal system, a liberal legal system, focuses on equality of process rather than equality of outcome. And Crenshaw calls equality of process a restrictive view of equality, an equality of outcome, an expansive view of equality. So if you're focused on equality of outcome, or what the results are, you might take a look at this fictitious case that I came up with, the case of the 100 employed white men. If you're taking an expansive view, you might look at that and you would say, okay, this company had 400 applicants for these 100 positions. 200 of the applicants were black. If all 100 people hired were white, then there must be something wrong with the process. We can't necessarily trust the process because a white applicant had a 50% chance of being offered a job, whereas a black applicant had a 0% chance of being offered a job. No black applicants were offered jobs. So a critical race theorist would say, let's look into the actual criteria that are being used, because the results are clearly discriminatory even in the absence of actual intent. So there's a problem in the process, even if nobody is intending that to be the outcome. But you can also see how this kind of outcome is evidence or offers evidence into another tenet of critical race theory, which is that the color blindness of liberalism may lead people to believe that the process is fair and neutral, and that actual existing inequalities must be the result of individual or cultural shortcomings rather than systemic discrimination. So I'm sure that you can easily imagine many people saying, faced with this example that I've offered, many people would say, well, they probably hired 100 white men because those were the people who were most qualified for the job. The 200 racialized applicants who applied for this job must not have had the qualifications. And critical race theorists would argue that that's exactly the kind of thinking that formal equality, formal color blindness leads you to. So I'm going to close this lecture with two images that I hope will